Okay, let's get into it then. So, welcome to the, I guess, 黑报广播. You're one of our early participants, but a very important one. Thank you so much, Melvin, for joining us. Have a couple of questions today about your research and about your work, and would love to hear your insights on what you've been up to. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Okay, so I'm Melvin Barnes, PhD from Ohio State University. I had studied Chinese history, East Asian history for uh, 13 years before completing school, and now I work as a program officer in the state of Ohio, and I also teach occasionally at Ohio State University.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and let's get right into these questions. So, a lot of what I formulated these questions on was that article that we talked about with kind of Black Panther alliances with China in the 60s and 70s. So, Black liberation. What do you think made China a compelling ally for Black liberation movements during the 60s and 70s, and how did this relationship shape perceptions of anti-imperial solidarity, in your opinion?
So I think that there's a lot of reasons why China was a sort of a really attractive um, potential ally for African American revolutionaries. A big part of that was obviously the PRC's opposition to the United States government, which these activists also had a very antagonistic relationship with the U.S. government. So that was a very positive um, on the side of China. The other thing was also that China was seen as a rising non-white power. So they were a little different from, obviously very different from the United States, but even different from the Soviet Union, which by the 60s and 70s, some elements of the sort of African American left had begun to grow disillusioned with. So they saw that there was, or they perceived that there was a greater sort of solidarity, a greater shared foundation that they could build with China as opposed to maybe some of the other potential leftist Marxist allies. So those are two, I think, really key um, proponents there. The other thing is that the PRC was actively courting, um, these African American activists, right? So they have a very strong relationship that develops with Du Bois in the late 1950s. And then obviously you end up having Robert F. Williams through the 60s and eventually sort of members of the Black Panther Party, including Huey Newton, into the late 60s, early 70s. So there were some foundations there. And there's also a very real um, some things that were perceived to be shared experiences, and that is a really long tail of sort of this idea of who had suffered at the hand of the imperialists, and even evolved quite a bit from the early 20th century.
Very cool. In you kind of describing kind of the evolution of who was participating and who had these connections throughout the ages, I immediately thought of, okay, the narrative for China would be solidarity with Black Americans, solidarity in some sort of Pan-African sense with the continent of Africa. Where is that distinction made? Was there a distinction in your research that you were able to find? Because you said that there was a targeting, but was that targeting just some sort of political ploy, to separate certain American factions from each other, or was there some, was it something else?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's a very real belief in these connections and these ties, and then there's also very deliberate efforts to sort of pull out those people who could be useful for a particular cause. So, I mean, Africa and the African Americans in sort of that plan are are linked. A lot of those people don't. Some of them come to China by way of stops in Africa, because this is at the moment where you start to have decolonization. So you have a lot more of these independent African states that are popping up. Ghana in particular, where there are some African Americans who end up actually traveling through an African state before they arrive in China. One notably is Victoria Garvin. She is working in, or not Victoria Garvin. Oh, I'm blanking on her name. I'm blanking on her name at the moment, but she's teaching English in Ghana, and then ultimately is approached by some Chinese officials, and they kind of convince her, like, "Hey, you should come work and teach English in China." She may not actually have been teaching English in Ghana, but she was teaching in Ghana. Goes to teach English in China in the mid 1960s and stays there um, for the basically until the early 1970s. So these ideas and groups of people are very much so um, connected in strong ways in that 1960s.
Very cool. Very cool. Um, we talked about this kind of targeting of black revolutionaries, and there's obviously visits, historical visits that certain members of parties visited and met with high officials in China. I'm curious in your research, what do these moments tell us about the potential and then also the limitations of cross-cultural revolutionary alliances?
Yeah, so a lot of those like travels early on. So Du Bois, you know, Newton later, Robert F. Williams. These are like highly coordinated sort of events where you have these high profile African Americans who are coming in. They're getting very preferential treatment. You're getting the red carpet rolled out, and they especially come away with very sort of positive impressions of the PRC in the 1960s. What's interesting is that Du Bois had been traveling to East Asia since, for decades before that. He had visited northeastern China. He was in Manchuria. Um, while it was under the Japanese occupation, he had visited Japan as well. And obviously, before the 1960s, he was much more in favor, for the 1950s, much more in favor of the Empire of Japan. But after World War II and Japan's defeat, he kind of makes this switch over to the PRC. And part of that was those sort of very tight, coordinated visits that he had. But one thing that you don't really necessarily see in those visits are like the maybe some of the aspects of life in China that maybe they would not have been quite so in favor of. Now, some of the people who stayed in China, especially as China embarked on the Cultural Revolution in 1965, 1966, they would have engaged with much more controversial or seen things that like maybe all these aren't as positive as maybe we had anticipated. But once you get beyond sort of rapprochement with the U.S., you start to have a new sort of crop of African Americans that are traveling to China, and they're getting a much more sort of what I would call like unadulterated view. One of those people being someone like John Hope Franklin, who goes to China in the 1970s. And he makes some, obviously has a lot of very positive observations, but also has some observations that are far less positive. And you think in those early years, like the 60s, they're probably spending a lot of time in places that are like Beijing, which is going to be much more cosmopolitan. They're not, probably not spending too much time trekking in the far western regions of China or Yunnan or something like that. But there's certain sort of challenges, and you look at the 19. So you move from the 60s and 70s into the 80s, and you start to have like more sort of you have African students who are living in China, and there's a series of sort of um, clashes that are you could argue are based in sort of cultural differences on campuses where these students are studying, and some of them are very big sort of blow-ups in political issues, and the same, and that goes all the way back to the late 1950s, early 1960s, where you had a lot of African students actually leave China in the early 1960s as a result of what some of them would have argued was racial discrimination, but they had also arrived in China at a really rough time during the kind of Great Leap Forward. So there was a lot of obviously very positive engagements that worked very smoothly, and then there was also a lot of um, engagements that were not quite as smooth, where there was a steep learning curve for what it means to kind of live life as a uh, black person in China.
Yeah. Very interesting. Just by way of comparison, at that time, I guess, being Black American and going around the world, the reception is different in different countries. Um, is there anything in your research or in your opinion that would kind of point to the fact that the experience in China was somewhat better or somewhat more accommodating? Because you do talk about there's some good, there's some bad, but then yeah, compared to the American experience, would there be a pull, do you think, to go to somewhere like East Asia?
Yeah, so this is the part that I think is really interesting about the research. I think sometimes, especially people who, depending on where you are and what your situation is, you kind of look across, um, the world or whatever, and you see, you're like, oh, like I would be treated better here or there. Um, but, in my research, one thing that I've realized is that every place that you go to, the sort of social, political, racial lines are different. And I think sometimes, especially when you are less sort of savvy about a place, you think that those lines don't exist and they only exist in, say, the Western context, right? And one thing that I think Americans in particular are not necessarily as good at is thinking about the social, racial, ethnic context of a particular place outside of the U.S. context, right? So I think that a lot of Americans think about race and they think that it operates in the same way. Like this is the only place in which like these racial lines exist. And one of the interesting things that was an impetus for me to kind of study this was my first experience studying in China was at a nationalities university, right? So I was in Southwest China at Southwest University for Nationalities, and I remember talking to a Chinese um, professor there at the time, and he was very upset about Tibetans and he went on this long diatribe uh, telling me that these people are dangerous, they carry knives, they get preferential treatment in all of these different places like colleges and universities and jobs. And I remember thinking to myself, this sounds very familiar. I've heard this before, but the difference was the context. It wasn't about me, it was about someone else, right? So I show up here and I realize, like, oh, these people don't necessarily have strong opinions about me, um, neither here nor there in this place, because, like, there's not enough of me there to matter. I'm not taking resources or great numbers of resources away from people or anything like that. I'm a guest, a tourist kind of moving around. And that really sparked my research kind of in like, oh, well, China has these same lines that we have in the US. They just are different and placed differently. And I think that a lot of us kind of looking to different countries, China, Japan, Korea, whatever, you see like, oh, that line doesn't cross me. And you don't realize until you've been there for a little while and you've learned the language that those lines cross other people. And sometimes they do eventually cross you. And one thing that I learned when I was looking at, and this is an argument that I make, is that there was that political utility, right, of bringing in these African Americans and African students in the 1960s, 70s. Um, but after sort of Mao dies in 1976, I argue that, people had become tired of 2 decades of constant revolution, kind of interrupting their lives. And what they actually wanted was a little bit more sort of stability and a little bit more emphasis on sort of that economic development. And I suspect that a lot of the tension that existed between the African students and the Chinese students in the 1980s was in part was because there was a perception that the African students in the 80s were drawing on the resources of China at a time when China needed to use its resources to modernize itself. Um, and that's where you see when you have that competition there. So these students are coming in and they maybe say they're African students. They feel like, oh, they're getting preferential treatment. And then obviously there's the issue of like dating women, that would cause controversy in the 80s. And one thing that I've noted in my travels there was that there was a very clear difference between how I was treated as an African American and how many of my friends who were coming from the African continent uh, were treated. I remember thinking like, oh, I didn't necessarily feel like I had if any problems, but I talking to some of the African students, I remember there was guys from I think they were from Liberia, and they had they were just very upset, and I was like, "Oh man, you had a very different experience than I've had." And I think part of that may have been maybe they're looking at me, and this was years ago, so maybe they're looking at me and thinking, "Hey, you're not here taking resources." I don't know if they just reflexively say like, "Hey, you're from the U.S. or whatever. You're probably contributing something." This was before all of the trade tensions. Whereas maybe they saw those other students and thought like, "Hey, like we're helping you. You're not doing anything for us." So I think it's really really complicated, and I think that there's an arc that people go through when they travel. You show up at a place and there's nothing wrong. Everything is perfect. And you start to learn the language, and you're like, wait, that dude said what about me, or what about this place? And then you level out and you realize that people are more or less the same. Wherever you go, people are really concerned with their quality of life, love, food, and there's good people and there's bad people no matter where you go. So I think that that's a lesson that we all kind of learn as we go through that journey.
It makes a lot of sense once you kind of understand the context because everybody's dealing with the same things, and I guess it comes like the the election period that just happened in the States, the same talking points. It's
Hmm.
always the same thing. Somebody else is gonna take your, somebody else is gonna
Yeah,
take your stuff, protect your
people
stuff.
playing on fear and this
Yeah.
sort of thing. And the thing that the
What? Oh,
reason
sorry.
why
Yeah.
I always kind of am a proponent of like, yeah, like everyone should live abroad. You should at some point in time travel. Go live in China, go live in Japan, go live in South Africa. And I think that the one thing that's really important to remember, or the distinction that was for me, was that in China, I didn't have, for better or for worse, I didn't have political power. Like, and I don't mean that in terms of like some way of saying that I'm disparaging the political system. But what I mean is that I'm not Chinese. Um, but, for whatever challenges you face, say at home, I can change those circumstances. It may not be easy, it may take time, it may be very difficult, but um, there are avenues that I can walk down, whether that's through education, through voting, things like that. But really, while I'm in China, I'm a guest, and there are positives to that, right? People tend to treat guests very well, but once you kind of start making that transition from that, that's when the reality changes a little bit for you.
Getting to a point where I'm speaking to friends about political things, you always kind of preface this with, I don't have much to say here. Or like even in Chinese, you just say like, 我没有发言权, like I don't have a ticket. I don't, what I say
Yeah.
isn't going to be counted in whatever this debate is, but here's my 2 cents. And, almost at that kind of removed level, you can
Yeah.
analyze, but ultimately what you say isn't contributing to the discourse.
And the beautiful thing is that in many ways it should, because the people who are removed, I think when you're in the cultural context, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. But sometimes those people who are standing on the sidelines are like, yo, what you guys are doing is actually not great. Like, yeah, and every like the I remember I went to Canada uh not that long ago, and this guy made a comment and I was like, dang, yeah, yeah, I think he's probably like, it took me a few years, but I was like, yeah, he was right. Like he was Oh man, we were on. So I was out in like Victoria. We're on this bus. Yeah, yeah, and we're on this bus. And the bus driver, he's an old Canadian, uh, in the military. Um, and somehow they got onto the U.S. and it had been and like it's probably like 2017. So I'm already like I'm in my feelings already. And the he said, he went on a long diatribe about the folks down in the U.S. and there's no he doesn't know that there are a couple of Americans on this bus, like, and I think he had said the Americans are most interested in God, guns, and money, and not in that order. And I remember being like, oh, for real? And then it hit me. I was like, might have had a point. So that's what I mean. Was yeah, I think that we have valuable contributions to make towards sort of discussions in places like China. But whether or not people listen to us is you know the real question. And I think that having voices and this is what I said, having African Americans, African people of African descent, in conversations about China is very valuable because we see the world in a slightly different way. So it's not that our observations are necessarily more correct. It's just that we add different discussions, and I think that maybe if someone else had heard that conversation about Tibetan folks in 2007 or whenever I was in Southwest China, um, maybe it doesn't stand out to them, right? But coming from where I come from, my background, I was like, oh, this is very similar. But no one would ever say that it is, right? No one would ever make those. Um, yeah.
I think that's a really great point to lead into the next question, because well, the next question is, how do you see the legacy of these historical ties influencing modern China-Africa relations, or modern China-American relations, in particular, just the narratives around anti-imperialism, South-South cooperation, um, where are we finding these similarities? Because it's still a huge part of the development narrative and aid infrastructure. It's like, okay, America's not helping you as much as we are. And this is the case because we have this anti-imperial kinship. And we
Yeah.
never been colonized. Well, we've never colonized. We've been colonized. You've been colonized.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yes, we see there's similarities and some sort of, I guess, political
So
disparities and things like that. But
yeah,
yeah. Hmm.
this is the part where I would say that maybe my take is not as I don't know, the common sort of popular take, and that's that all of us create all of these states, right? Whether it's the United States, China, we create these broad political narratives, right? And to a certain extent, they do animate the relationships that these states create. But one thing that we have to be cognizant of is that global politics, international relations is a very sort of game of extracting what you need. And sometimes those narratives can be very useful in sort of helping you extract those needs. And what I mean by that is, especially so, if we look at China and African Americans, that was a fundamentally valuable relationship for both parties. But also, you have a state actor in the People's Republic of China and non-state actors in, say, people um, like Huey Newton, right? And built in that is a fundamental imbalance in sort of power and all of those things. So what I mean is that, and I'll let you jump in, but that in that relationship, the PRC was able to change the foundations of that relationship as needed, right? So in the 50s and 60s, it made sense to build really strong ties with these folks, like Robert F. Williams. But once you have rapprochement, those ties need to change for China, right? So they unilaterally were able to change the foundation of those ties. So like Robert F. Williams has returned to China, I'm sorry, the United States in the 1970s, and he's like, hey, there's something going on here in Michigan. I need you to help me out. Can you do an interview with me to kind of help get the word out? And the official who writes back to him says, like, hey, uh, we're kind of working on good relations with the U.S. right now, so we would appreciate it if you just kind of took a step back, follow all the rules, and don't create any trouble. Um, and we're not going to interview you right now. So it's this sudden shift in about face because now what China needs is different, right? Like they needed to cultivate friendly ties with the United States government. The United States government, for reasons, needed to cultivate friendly ties with China. So they were able to quickly shift the foundations of that relationship. And all of these relationships, so China's outreach with various African states, they are built on the sort of politics of a given moment. And those politics can change quickly, right? So I think that in terms of how, whether you're an African American political group or you're an African state, you have to always keep that in the forefront of your mind and understand that there are lots of discussions about friendship, and to a certain degree, that friendship and that stuff is all very real, but it can also change uh, very quickly. So you need to understand that these states, especially states, and not like people to people engagement, are built on sort of getting what the state needs. Um, and it's best that you operate with that in mind, is what I would say. I knew you were going to say something, Tyler, so hop in.
Oh no, you just hit a point that I've read over and over and over again. Um, are you familiar with FOCAC? Um,
No, no.
so it's a forum on China-Africa cooperation, and it's a strategic forum. They meet. They had one this year in 2024, and it's kind of like this. It's a massive summit with all of participatory African nations in Chinese trade on the continent, and they all negotiate their debt. They negotiate their spending, their infrastructure investments, and we talk about it as if it's some sort of bilateral trade. But I mean, yeah, sure, it's country to country, but then when you look at it at a macro level, it's country to continent. And in that relationship, inherently, that is unequal. Um, and so when you're talking about state to non-state, well, state actors to non-state actors, it just kind of clicked. I was like, okay, yeah, there is also this feeling that they need something here too. And the narrative might look like it's friendship and equal, but really what it is unequal equals maybe. Um, if
Yeah,
that makes sense. That was just the thing that kind of came up in my mind. Um, because yeah, there is friendship and there's solidarity, but at the end of the day, who's benefiting from what and under what circumstance? I think those questions are important to ask. Let me say it again for clarity. What can today's movements for social justice and anti-colonialism learn from the shared history of Black and Chinese solidarity?
yeah, I would say that one thing that we can learn is that you really want to um, interrogate the narratives that we create, especially the ones that sort of underskirt the relationship um, between these groups, right? So I think the perfect example or cautionary tale that I would give was that back in the 30s, Du Bois was a strong proponent of the Empire of Japan, and because of the nature of the struggle he had in the United States, he could not see the shortcomings of the Empire of Japan. Right? He thought that in their sort of colonial enterprises, the Chinese and the Koreans should just uh, accept, the activities of Japan, um, because they were fighting against what he saw as Western colonialism and imperialism. Um, Despite the fact that in some ways he was sort of backing the East Asian version of that. And what I think that that teaches us is that as we build these relationships, you also have to push the other side of those relationships to be the best version of themselves. So, uh, interrogating sort of the roots of those relationships, where you say, "Hey, we can build this out where we are working together on the true sort of basis of equality, right?" And so I think that, in terms of like international politics, there are friends of the moment, but there are oftentimes not uh, long-term good friends. And I think that, you're always pushing to kind of create that sort of relationship. So I just think that it means going into these sort of ties, these exchanges with very clear and sober eyes. Because if not, then you can allow those long narratives and sometimes say the struggle in your particular corner of the world to um, color the way that you see what's happening, I guess. Uh, so I just say, build those ties, build those friendly relationships, but um, be very clear eyed and try to ensure that, not only are you just kind of looking to benefit from those relationships, but you're also ensuring that they understand that you have contributions to give to the other side of that. And sometimes, that means you see eye to eye 100%. And sometimes that means that there are things that you need to be very sort of clear about in order to make the both of you as best as you can. So I think that, yeah, just clear eyed sort of engagement. And hopefully that'll produce relationships that, prove valuable uh, for everyone. And not ones that, they're good for a moment and then things change and suddenly they're not as good. Um, I think that's the way that we move forward.
Very nice and very well said. Thank you so much, Melvin. As we come to the close of this interview, is there anything else pressing that you would like to share, or any kind of research that you're currently working on that you want to plug here, or anything?
Not necessarily. I mean, I have written on it, but I think looking a little earlier into the ties is actually what I always say is like the a lot of the focus right now has been on that sort of solidarity between the 60s and the 70s and the 50s because it was Cold War, very exciting, and the ties were very clear. But those are bookended by continued sort of ties and ideas and exchanges. So there's a small group of people who are looking at like pre 1930s sort of Sino African American engagement, and then also looking at it, what does it look like into the 1980s and 1990s? I think that's the next set of questions that, as people dive into it, you'll find some interesting insights.
Very cool. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And I'm sure your work is going to be taken and it's going to be run with by a lot of other scholars in the future. I'm really glad that there's people out there that are drawing these connections and kind of understanding the patterns, um, and what these relationships bring, the limitations and the successes within them. Uh, yeah, thank you so much, Melvin, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Hey, super cool. Let me know if you ever need anything.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye bye. Good luck.